So I would like to thank the Paul Ramsay Foundation, our principal partner, for its support of this conference and of Philanthropy Australia much more broadly. The Paul Ramsay Foundation is committed to growing philanthropy in Australia by sharing best practice and leadership and supporting our ecosystem to improve our practice and achieve more impact. So I'm delighted to welcome, who was there? Oh, is there? Simon Freeman, the CEO, to the stage to say a few words and introduce our first speaker, Jeremy Heimans, who, by the way, is cited as the most influential Australian in the world today. So no pressure, Jeremy. Thanks, Simon.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's fantastic to be here representing the Paul Ramsay Foundation as principal partner and to welcome you all back for day 2. You made it back. Well done. Congratulations. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting here today and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge all our international guests. You've all travelled so far to make this such a wonderful and vibrant occasion. Sometimes we might feel that Australia is something of a philanthropic outpost, and maybe we feel a bit lonely out here. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you can all return safely home, bearing news that philanthropy is alive, well, and perhaps even thriving here in Australia. That philanthropy is thriving here in Australia is due in no small part to the leadership of Philanthropy Australia. I particularly want to pay tribute to Sarah, Alan, the wise, venerable members of the Leadership Council, and of course the wonderful Philanthropy Australia team. They've all worked so hard to make this event run so seamlessly up to now. So, looking forward to today, I am particularly excited by the launch of Foundation Maps. It's another Philanthropy Australia initiative. We at the Paul Ramsay Foundation are proud to be able to contribute all our granting data to this project, and we will continue to do so as part of our contribution to transparency and trust. Sarah, we're thrilled to be able to support you. We all want to see more and better philanthropy, but it is so vital that in this time of diminished trust that we have a strong voice representing us in the sector, so thank you. As Sarah said, my role as CEO of the Paul Ramsay Foundation. Our mission is to achieve better health and education outcomes for Australians. As many of you know, the foundation came into being 4 years ago, following the passing of our benefactor, Paul Ramsay. So I was particularly struck by Larry's comments yesterday. He said very openly that it took him 4 years of talking and researching before he even felt like he had an idea of what he was doing. I am therefore eagerly awaiting my own enlightenment in about 3 weeks' time. And if that never happens, maybe, just maybe, there's a chance I've been talking to all the wrong people, and it's all your fault. So, my main reason for standing up here is to introduce our next speaker and to get out of the way within the designated time slot. Jeremy Heimans is the co-founder and CEO of Purpose, a New York organisation that builds and supports social movements for a more open, just and habitable world. Jeremy's also been named one of Fast Company's most creative people in business and received the Ford Foundation's 75th Anniversary Visionary Award. Of course, Jeremy is probably best known as co-founder of GetUp, an organisation with more members than all Australian political parties combined. And it's that organisation that probably means he no longer receives Christmas cards from many Sky News presenters. I'm sure you're devastated. I did my research at 10 o'clock last night and I found out a very interesting fact about Jeremy, that he went to primary school with one of Paul Ramsay Foundation's partners, Tessa Boyd-Kane. Tessa was telling me that the two of them used to have debates at primary school as 10-year-olds. Now, I don't know what a pair of 10-year-olds would be debating. Cats versus dogs, boys versus girls, something like that. So we could have a debate here today, but I suspect you're more interested in hearing what Jeremy's got to say about new power and the shifting dynamics of philanthropy. So I'll leave you with Jeremy, and I want you all to have a great day, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to be back home in Australia where my accent is not considered exotic. And I want to talk to you all today about power. This is a room with tons and tons of power. You know, the ability to improve lives, the ability to change the direction of this country, and in some cases, the world. And what I want to talk to you about is the ways in which a very rapidly changing global context means that we need to think differently, compels us, I think, to think differently about the way each of us exercises our power. So we'll start by telling a few stories that sort of set the context for this world that we're in. And unfortunately, we'll start with Harvey Weinstein. So Harvey Weinstein, think about the way he exercised power. For decades, he managed to get away with an outrageous spree of abuse and harassment because he viewed power as a currency. He hoarded it up, he spent it to punish his enemies, to reward his friends and protectors. He created this whole industry where he sat at the top and was protected by it. At the beginning of the book we've written on New Power, we cite a survey that was taken of the people most thanked in Academy Award acceptance speeches over the last 30 years. And tied for first place of most thanked at Oscars acceptance speeches with Harvey Weinstein was God. So that gives you a sense of how powerful he was. Now, let's think about how different the Me Too movement that helped to topple Harvey and then has had an enormous impact, I think, over the last year, how differently power works in that movement. The power that Me Too has generated is not the kind of power you can hoard up. No one can direct or control that power. Instead of working like a currency, you'd best think of the Me Too movement as working like a current. It surges across the world. It's enabled by the participation of many people. The thing that unlocked the Me Too movement was that one person's testimony made possible the next person's testimony. It was that sense of strength in numbers, that sense of collective action, that took all of these things that had been hidden for so long and actually shone light on them. It's changed as it's gone all over the world. So the Me Too movement started in the US, but in France it became, in a very French way, denounce your pig. So you get this sense of how these movements, with many leaders, right, with many protagonists, are still exercising enormous power, even though it looks very different to the kind of power that Harvey wielded. Second story, Barack Obama. So we all remember 2008. We remember that moment when we were all inspired by a campaign that was about us. He said famously, "We are the ones we've been waiting for." Millions of Americans gave him micro-donations, organized in their own communities, created this enormous base of volunteers. It truly was a campaign that was made by many, and it helped him eclipse the sort of very old and very set apparatus of the Clintons, who had all of those big money donors. But then think about Obama as a president. Obama as president didn't really bring that movement that he built in with him into the White House. You might say that Obama's movement didn't move without him. And so at the end of 8 years, even though he was enormously popular personally and achieved quite a lot, it's also clear that he hadn't elected his successor, his party was in tatters, and he hadn't made American government more participatory. So it's a story, again, about these two different ways of using power in two very different settings. Third story, more sobering. On the right is Aqsa Mahmood. She is a young Scottish teenager, 17 years old at the time this photo was taken. She was a normal kid. She loved Harry Potter. She grew up in the suburbs of Glasgow. One day, she finds her way from the bus station in Glasgow. She disappears. Her parents hear from her 3 days later. She's calling from Syria. She's joined the Islamic State. Once she's there, she becomes one of the most notorious recruiters for the Islamic State. And we studied her methods for the book. It was fascinating and disturbing. She built this really intimate girl-to-girl network that basically adapted this ideology. The ideology of ISIS is a medieval theocracy bent on oppressing women, and yet it was flexible enough that she could adapt it perfectly to kind of lure other girls, as they then did, from the West to join her in Syria. She had a blog with emojis and memes saying, "This is how to leave your family behind. These are the toiletries I recommend you bring when you make jihad." Right? It sounds banal, but it was incredibly effective. Now, contrast that with the US government and the way they responded to the threat of ISIS. The first thing they do is they literally just scramble fighter jets and use a technique they'd been using since the First World War, which was to rain down leaflets on the civilian populations of Iraq and Syria, telling them, don't join ISIS. You think about that idea of raining your ideas down on high versus what Aqsa's doing, which is spreading those ideas sideways, right? The second thing they did is they said, okay, well, I guess these Islamic State people are very good on social media, so we should probably do the same. And they created this Twitter account, Think Again, Turn Away, in English, trying to dissuade potential jihadis just on the brink of joining ISIS, where, of course, the most compelling spokespeople was the seal of the US State Department. Because potential jihadis are really into US foreign policy. So you get, again, these two very different mindsets in this context. So this sort of brings us to this thesis of these two different ways to exercise power that we exist with today, that are battling, that are balancing, that are combining. And we call them old and new power. Old power, power as currency. New power, power as current. Old power relies on what you have, what you own, what you control, that no one else does. New power relies on the participation of many. It's open, it's based on, it's constitutive of the things that people contribute to it. Here's another way to think about the difference between old and new power. Who knows what this is? Tetris. It's a good age group for that question. So this is the biggest, I count myself in that age group, to be clear. This is the biggest game of the 20th century, the biggest video game of the 20th century. Think about the mechanics of Tetris, right? Basically, these blocks are falling down on your head. Your job is to sort them into neat lines. You have no agency, and eventually you're overwhelmed by the blocks that fall upon you. So it's a good metaphor for old power. It's also curious and interesting that the Russians invented Tetris, potentially as a way to distract a generation of Americans during the Cold War. So what's this? Minecraft. So Minecraft is the most popular video game of the 21st century. And what's interesting is that even though it has in common with Tetris the blocks, right? It's a block-based game. It works completely differently, right? Everything in Minecraft is created by its users. There are no rules, and in order to build these worlds, and let me tell you, almost everything in the physical world is also in Minecraft, right? Has been built by users. People have had to build that together. So you think about a young kid, right, who's growing up in a Minecraft world where they're creating all of these things, they're not living in a Tetris world. It really shifts your expectations around the world, your role in it, and your sense that you must participate. And that brings us to this clash of values between old and new power values that we set out. And I think it's important to note here that our argument is not old power bad, new power good. In fact, if you look at this chart, there are many things on the left-hand column that we need to protect, things like expertise. That said, you'll probably recognize a lot of things on the left from traditional philanthropy, right? Certainly managerialism, certainly resource consolidation, certainly a lack of transparency, a belief in expertise. And you see the way these values are now being challenged by this very different set of norms, right? This belief that we should have more opt-in, more networked governance. I might add, sometimes that means governance that is much less representative. A belief in collaboration as an end in itself. A belief in radical transparency. You think about what that means for organizations. We have this expression we use, which is that institutions today in the current reality need to occupy themselves before they themselves are occupied. Because even if you want to maintain a world of that kind of separation, it's often not realistic. Hillary Clinton, in the 2016 campaign, gave a speech that was leaked, in which she said, look, in politics, sometimes you need a private position and a public position, and those positions need to be different. I agree with that. I think that's a legitimate perspective in terms of how you get things done. But then think about what happened to her. That transparency literally arrived at her doorstep and blew up via WikiLeaks, and it had a devastating impact on her campaign. So you see all of these dynamics, you see the attack on expertise, which we'll come back to later, and this belief that experts are much less important because now everybody, in many contexts, can do the work of experts. And the challenges that poses for philanthropy and for your own grantees, and we'll come back to that. So What we then did, we originally published this thinking in Harvard Business Review, and anyone who's read HBR will know that you're basically contractually obliged to include a 2x2 matrix. So this was our 2x2 matrix. And the overlay here are organizations, right, and their models. So does their core operating model look more like Tetris or Minecraft? Is it more based on capture and control, or is it more based on these participatory dynamics? And what are the values evinced by that organization? Are they more tracking to that left-hand column, those old power values, or more to the right, the new power values? So let's take a quick tour of this compass. The castles quadrant. In the castles quadrant, you see most traditional organizations. Most of our social institutions still run on old power. I would guess that many of your organizations still run in this quadrant. But it's important to note that there are various strategies here. So Apple's a good example, I think, of an old power company that still runs on technology. So one of the mistakes people make is they think, oh, technology, that's new power. But it really isn't. There are plenty of ways to use technology to run the same old game. Right? In Apple's case, it's got a business model that's based on these genius product designers in Cupertino who kind of know what we need before we know we need it. And as a company, culturally, they're very secretive. They're not collaborative. That said, they're the most valuable company in the world. So you can still have a successful strategy in the castles quadrant, but not everybody can be Apple. On the bottom right, you've got the cheerleaders. These are organizations with old power models. Their core model's still very top-down. Think of a newspaper like The Guardian. The Guardian still has expert journalists who write things that we read, but it is changing. So it's beginning to bring its readers into what they do. It has this conception of members now. It makes more money from its members than it does from its subscribers. And the conception of the members is that they become involved in the work of the newspaper. They've opened up parts of their journalism to their readers. They've asked their readers to be activists on their own behalf. Top right quadrant are the crowds quadrant. These are organizations with both new power values and new power models. It's important to note there's a big variety here. So in the top right, you've got movements like Black Lives Matter. And these movements do not look or resemble traditional institutions, which I might add is a challenge for funders, because sometimes it's hard to know how to fund those movements, and we'll talk more about that later. But they're incredibly important and they're having a huge impact. They're often dismissed as being leaderless, but if you ask the founders of Black Lives Matter, they would, I think, accurately describe them as leaderful. They cultivate many leaders, not one charismatic leader at the top. You also have models and businesses like Airbnb that are very skillfully exploiting these new power dynamics. And then that brings us to the top left. I think this is the most interesting quadrant today, and the most dangerous one. We call them the co-opters. So you think about these co-opter players. You think about Facebook. So Facebook is a brilliantly effective new power model. How could any of us deny that? 2 billion of us participating. They've captured and in many ways harvested our participatory energies. Yet if you think about that model, we have no share in its governance, we have no visibility into that algorithm that we now know shapes our thoughts, our feelings, our political opinions, and we certainly have no share in the economic value that is being created by Facebook. I think it's also striking that that mindset I think also is replicated a little bit in the way that the Chan Zuckerberg initiative was conceived. No doubt incredibly well intentioned, but it was really curious and interesting to me that even though Mark Zuckerberg made his fortune on the backs of understanding how to get people to participate, when he announced his foundation, he said, I'm going to spend $45 billion, there'll be no applications from the public, and I'm going to hire a very small number of experts to decide how to spend that money. Striking. So these players are really interesting because they're actually winning in a lot of cases today because they're kind of exploiting these new power dynamics, but they're also vulnerable. They're vulnerable because they have new power bases that may rise up against them, as we're seeing the beginnings of with Facebook. So an interesting question for all of you, think about where your organization, where your philanthropy or your NGO fits on this framework today. And ask yourself where you want it to move in 5 years. When we do this exercise, almost everyone wants to move somewhere. Not everybody wants to move or should move to that top right quadrant. But understanding and thinking about the ways that both your models and your values can shift, I think could be a very useful exercise. So what I now want to do is talk a little bit about the implications of all of this for philanthropy, for your grantees, for this world that we all inhabit. And the first thing that I'll note is that I think that as we saw with the compass, in many ways, the most effective actors today are actually effectively blending old and new power. They have an old power repertoire and a new power repertoire. Now, most of the organizations in this room have a pretty damn good old power repertoire, right? You understand power as currency, you're philanthropists. And you're good at using that repertoire. So the real challenge is often to develop a new power repertoire. In the case of the NRA, I think it's so interesting to think, why does the NRA keep winning, right? 90% of Americans support background checks, compulsory background checks, which is the kind of core political debate in the US over guns. And yet, that has not prevailed politically. And the reason is they're incredibly effective both with old and new power. So they have this unbelievable old power repertoire. Politicians, quake in their boots at the mere thought of being attacked by the NRA. But they also have this intense grassroots base that they cultivate. And they, in fact, do not try to control that base. They take the opposite posture, which, a bit like Donald Trump, they unleash that base. And they allow the extremes of that base to grow and flourish, and then they use that intensity and that energy at those key political moments and deploy it. So on the other side of that debate, the organization I run, Purpose, has been working pretty hard. We helped Mike Bloomberg set up Everytown, and Everytown is this attempt to be a long-term counterweight to the NRA. And the critical thing that Everytown is trying to do, before Everytown, Mike Bloomberg's strategy on guns was largely lots of money, right? Big TV ads, big lobbying. And the recognition after the continuous failure of efforts to regulate guns in America was that you also needed real new power. So Everytown is both an institution, but it's also a movement. And it's a movement that has mobilized mums in America. It's a movement that's helping those incredible kids who emerged out of the Parkland massacre take the energy they've generated and turn it into real power. So that blending of old and new power is, I think, what's going to help push that issue. And actually, for the first time, I think, in decades, the dynamics of that issue in America are beginning to shift. The second thing I'd say is that, and this is, I think, very important to your grantees, the future is going to be a battle over mobilization. The people who can mobilize best in this very crowded world are going to win. And the reality of that then means that your grantees, whether they're technical, they're doing great programmatic work, they're going to need to learn these new skills of new power. You think about climate scientists, right? For too long, climate scientists have relied on the fact that they're right? The facts are on their side, and I think naturally they instinctively feel it should be enough that we're right. The white paper and the symposium are their weapons. But you think about the climate deniers who are chipping away at that, the damage that they did in the lead up to the Copenhagen conference some years back. It's incredibly, they're using new power incredibly effectively. And these new power forces that are trying to provoke hate and misinformation start at an advantage. And the reason they do is because they're unconstrained by facts and because they trade in provocation. And in this context, that is what generates people's engagement and clicks. So it's a real challenge. And I think it is incumbent then on all of us to train these new power, to train these old power forces that you support in these new skills so they can survive and not be swamped by these dynamics. Thirdly, I would certainly argue that all of you need to think more about investing in new power, investing in these new social movements, investing in bottom-up participatory forms of power. This is something I'm really, I think is a fabulous initiative in Australia called Farmers for Climate Action that Anna Rose, who I think is in the room somewhere, was involved in setting up. I think this is a brilliant example of that. So this is farmers building a conservative, politically conservative constituency in favor of climate action, and the work is about organizing farmers, building their capacity to have a political voice. And so this is something that the Purpose Climate Lab, which we set up to kind of both fund and execute on campaigns around the world that move beyond the already convinced on climate, was lucky enough to seed fund and support. And it's an example of the Purpose Climate Lab is doing very serious campaigning at large scale. It's spent about $40 million over the last few years on movements, on campaigns, not just on the technocratic solutions that are naturally easier to fund because they're often more measurable, they're clearer, they make us feel like we've had a very clear impact, but which don't necessarily build power. And that building of power in a sense, is the challenge. So the thought experiment, I think, for philanthropy is, we hear a lot these days about spending down endowments. But what about the thought experiment of what it would mean for a philanthropy to spend down their power? To set about being less powerful by investing in building power that would make some of their investments less relevant over time, make their role as protagonists less over time. And so I think that's an interesting metaphor for the challenges, and I think in the Australian context, we just set up an office here in Australia for purpose, so I'm excited to see how can we help to build that culture of investing in advocacy and movement building more in Australia, because I see it in the US, I see it even in Europe at a much higher scale than here. So I want to leave you with a message and a story. And that message is, how can all of us use new power to help the least powerful? Because I think ultimately we live in a world in which this new power is being used in very good ways and in very harmful ways. And this is the story of some work that we did on Syria, where we were approached by a bunch of philanthropists who, about 4 or 5 years ago now, said, look, how do we get the public to care about Syria, given that all over the Western world there's almost no aid commitments, no refugee resettlement commitments, and people don't really understand that Syria is a humanitarian crisis. They think it's all these extremists fighting amongst themselves, so we don't have any moral obligation to help. So what we did is we found this incredible group of workers, rescue workers, who'd formed these voluntary bands inside Syria, ordinary people who were basically doing emergency rescue work, pulling people out of rubble, saving lives after the barrel bombs by the Assad regime. And we told their story, and then we mobilized people around it. And this is a video to finish us off that kind of captures that story.
في أحد الأيام تعرضت منطقة الأنصاري لقصف بالبراميل المتفجرة. حصلنا نطالع العيلة الأولى والعيلة الثانية. العيلة الثالثة هي الأم والولد. هي فعلاً يعني الأم كانت كثير منفعلة. عندها كثير كانت عصبية وكانت عم تصيح، يعني هي خايفة على حالها أو خايفة على ابنها. بعد الحفل الطويل حصلنا نسمع صوت الولد، صوت صار يبكي الولد. حصلنا نسمع صوته وكان كثير محل صعب. بعد ما وصلنا لولد هون صار الشغل كثير بده حذر، يعني هذا ولد عمره أسبوعين أو أكثر، بأي لحظة بيطب شي فوقه أو بيموت أو بيختنق. هلا 12 ساعة طبعاً هي ما يمكن تنقاد، يعني عمل كثير حذر، يعني هي روح بدك تتعامل معها بشكل خطير جداً. يعني إنه طفل عمره أسبوعين يطب فوقه برميل أو 3 سقوف ما يستوي شيء، يعني وكل هالضغوطات وإنه هذا الطفل يطلع أقوى من البراميل وأقوى من السقوف وأقوى من كل شيء.
هذا إعجازه. يا رب يا الله. تبارك اسمك. أمه وينه؟ عدل أمك الماء. الله شوي خالد عليه يا خالد. الله يا الله. هاتوني هو. ثواني أبيسك ثواني أيتي يا أفي.
زرتوا الولد بعد ما انقذتوه؟
ما عندنا وقت، قولي له قصف.
So, incredible movement around the world is built up around these incredible humans. Millions of dollars have been raised in crowdfunding. They've become the face of hope in Syria. They've carried this message of the enormous humanitarian crisis there. That's the little boy now, safe in Turkey. But very sadly, the man who pulled him out of that rubble and saved his life was killed doing that work last year. So hopefully that underscores the stakes of this work, and I'm very much looking forward to working with all of you in the Australian context on this issue. Thanks so much.